You probably think retirement in a small Oregon town sounds peaceful. That's what I thought too, until my wife ended up injured on our front steps. Thanks to a clipboard-wielding tyrant in a tight polo shirt, I'm Nathan Granger, Delta Force veteran, and I didn't survive 3 decades of war just to get pushed around by a suburban dictatorship. When Troy Maddox from the Redwood Hollow, HOA, laid hands on Elena, something old woke up in me. Not rage, not revenge, precision. I didn't come for a fight. But if they wanted one, I'd make it the last war they ever started. After 27 years in Delta Force, I didn't ask for much, just silent solitude and a porch deep enough for 2 rocking chairs. That's why Elena and I chose Redwood Hollow, a quiet Oregon town tucked between towering pines and the hum of a cold water creek. She fell in love with the backyard, already picturing where her herbs would grow. I liked the shed, enough space for my woodworking bench, and a freezer full of trout from the nearby river. We thought we'd found peace. We planted flowers, hosted a few cookouts, and I started offering free self-defense classes to the local kids. Elena worked part-time at the Red Valley ER, still doing what she loved, healing people. To celebrate our 30th anniversary, I built her a trellis, 4 weeks of carving and sanding finished with cedar stain, and my initials burned quietly into the base. She cried when I showed her, said it was perfect. 3 mornings later, the HOA came knocking. A man named Troy Maddox, muscles straining against his HOA polo, handed me a citation and a $500 fine, unapproved structure. He said, not even glancing at the craftsmanship. That was the day the peace we fought so hard for started to crack. I didn't raise my voice, didn't argue. I just took the citation from Troy Maddox, thanked him with the kind of calm that usually made men like him uncomfortable, and closed the door. Elena stood behind me, holding a mug of tea she never got to sip. Her eyes told me not to let it ruin our morning. So I didn't, not outwardly. That evening, I reviewed the HOA regulations. 56 pages of legal jargon, dressed up as neighborhood values. No mention of trellises, specifically. Just vague references to permanent vertical structures requiring pre-approval. I highlighted what I needed and submitted a retroactive application the next morning. 3 days later, it was denied, and then the avalanche began. In the same envelope, 5 new violations appeared. Mailbox not HOA. Standard beige lawn, half an inch too high. Garbage can visible from the road. Unauthorized horticulture in Elena's herb garden, and complaints about unlicensed martial arts activity on our property. Combined, over $2,000 in fines. I knew targeted harassment when I saw it. On deployment, we called this psychological shaping. Pressure a target until they fold or lash out. Someone wanted us gone, but what they didn't understand was that I'd been trained to operate in exactly this kind of environment. One built on intimidation, silence, and manufactured authority, and I had no intention of folding. I didn't react like they expected. No angry emails, no shouting at board meetings. I simply moved into a different mode of thinking. One I hadn't used since my last covert operation in northern Syria. This wasn't about a trellis anymore. This was about power. Who had it? Who abused it? And how to dismantle it without firing a shot. I started watching, documenting every rule they enforced on us that they ignored elsewhere. A neighbor 2 houses down had a similar trellis untouched. Cynthia Harrow, the HOA president, had a gazebo built last year without any paperwork filed. Leon Vickers, their treasurer, parked his RV in front of his house for 2 weeks straight, not a single citation. I filed a second appeal. Denied again, with a condescending note from the HOA secretary reminding me that our community thrives on uniformity. Elena said we should just let it go. She'd had a rough shift, lost a teenage boy in a car crash, and didn't want to deal with more conflict. She walked out to the trellis with a screwdriver in hand. That's when it happened. Troy Maddox and 2 other HOA compliance officers were already in our yard. No warning, no notice, just stomping through our garden like it belonged to them. When Elena tried to intervene, Troy pushed her aside. I heard her cry out from inside the garage. The sound flipped a switch in my spine. When I got to her, she was on the ground clutching her shoulder, face pale, lips tight, dislocated. Possibly worse. Troy stood over her arms, crossed like he was proud of himself. One of the others held a camera. I helped Elena up slowly, gently. The way you handle something precious that's already been broken. Once before, I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I just looked Troy in the eye and memorized everything about him. His stance, his badge number. The smirk he thought was untouchable. That moment wasn't the beginning of the fight. It was the end of their advantage. The hospital confirmed what I already suspected. Elena's shoulder was dislocated, and there was likely a tear in the rotator cuff. No surgery, for now, but strict rest. I watched her sleep that night. Her arm immobilized, her breath shallow from the pain meds, and I made a decision. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to bury them. The next morning, I walked over to Wesley Crane's house. He was already in his garage workshop, sipping black coffee and fiddling with an old shortwave radio. I didn't need to explain much. He'd lived here 15 years and seen the HOA drive out at least 5 families. He opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a binder 2 inches thick, notes copies of old violations, photos of unpermitted structures. The board ignored on their own homes. Janine joined us. She'd been a reporter for the Red Valley Gazette before downsizing, gutted the staff, but she still had sources and fire. Within 20 minutes, she was already cross-referencing HOA expenses with county property records. Cynthia Harrow, the queen bee, had inherited her house after her husband's death. A death ruled carbon monoxide poisoning in the garage. Wesley raised his eyebrows. The report had been signed by none other than Deputy Rick Bowen. Things clicked into place. Leon and Vickers fired quietly from First Citizens Bank 3 years ago. Embezzlement suspected, never proven. Troy Maddox sealed record. But Wesley had a copy of an old court docket. Domestic battery, charges dropped. No convictions, but patterns emerged. They weren't just petty tyrants. They were a criminal network, dressed in golf shirts and HOA lanyards. That night, I called Caleb Rowe. He didn't hesitate. Said I saved his life once when Elena stayed up for 18 hours straight, sewing him back together after a training accident. This was payback. We divided the tasks. Caleb and I would go after the legal structure. Janine would track the money. Wesley would document the selective enforcement with time-stamped photos I installed. Cameras. Created maps. Labeled connections like I was back in a mission briefing room. Redwood Hollow thought it had a homeowners association problem. What it really had was a veteran with too much time, too much training, and a debt to settle. I started with the bylaws. HO A's love to bury power in paperwork, but they also leave a trail. Section 3.2 required financial transparency. Section 4.7 mandated fair and equal enforcement. Section 7.3 allowed any resident to speak on matters of safety at scheduled meetings. Something I plan to use soon. In the meantime, I launched something simple but subversive. A neighborhood forum, private, encrypted, anonymous. At first, just a few residents joined, but within a week, the stories started pouring in. An elderly widow fined $300 for having a wheelchair ramp that wasn't pre-approved. A mixed-faith family cited for unauthorized holiday displays because they included both a menorah and a nativity scene. A young couple told to remove a garden box built for their autistic son's sensory therapy. It wasn't enforcement. It was punishment for being different, for speaking up, for not fitting into Cynthia Harrow's sterile little empire. I posted guides, how to document violations, how to request financial records under Oregon's HOA statutes, how to appeal fines legally. Caleb drafted sample letters. Janine dug up expense reports showing thousands paid to consultants who didn't exist. Cynthia responded like any tyrant would with threats. She issued a newsletter declaring the forum unauthorized communication, hinting at fines for spreading misinformation. But Caleb was ready with a legal memo showing HOA boards couldn't control private speech under state law. I made sure every mailbox got a copy. Meanwhile, Elena Sling and all started calling her nurse friends, others who'd been targeted or intimidated. The web grew. Wesley installed a second round of cameras catching Troy Maddox lurking near our backyard again. Phone in hand, like he was casing the place. They were watching us, but now we were watching back closer, smarter, and with the kind of coordination that only comes from years of tactical operations. They thought they were dealing with a cranky old soldier. What they didn't see was the network forming under their noses and the storm about to break over their heads. The escalation was textbook desperation. One afternoon, I came home to find our front door plastered with a fresh cluster of violation notices. 12 in total. Trash bin visibility, unauthorized vehicle, my same truck that hadn't moved in 6 months, leaf debris on the walkway, non-compliant lighting fixture, the fines, over $5,000 if left unpaid. Leon Vickers even slipped a hand-delivered settlement offer into our mailbox. Drop the forum, withdraw our appeal to the state, and they'd consider waiving the outstanding fines provided. We also consider relocating. It wasn't subtle. It was extortion, dressed in HOA letterhead. I smiled as I read it. They were breaking formation, cracking under pressure. But the worst came the next day, and it didn't arrive in an envelope. It walked into the emergency room. Elena was checking in a new patient. Troy Maddox motorcycle accident, broken wrist road rash. He saw her froze for a beat, then sneered. She didn't flinch. She cleaned his wounds, adjusted his IV, explained his treatment with the same clarity and kindness she gave every patient, no matter who they were. Later that night, she told me Troy had asked her why she was being nice. Her answer was simple, because being decent isn't conditional. That cracked something in him. A man like Troy doesn't understand. Respect that isn't enforced through fear. But that's the kind of damage people like Cynthia never see. Coming. The rot within their own ranks. the loyalty that turns brittle under moral weight. The next morning, I got a burner email. No name, no greeting, just scanned. Bank statements and a message. Check accounts ending in 4178 and 9621 they're skimming. Maddox is out. That's when I knew the internal fracture had begun. We weren't just winning legally, we were turning their people. And once a system starts leaking from the inside, collapse is only a matter of time. By the time I verified the account numbers, I already had the rest of the puzzle in motion. One was a joint account under Cynthia Harrow and her sister's name registered to a landscaping firm that didn't actually exist. The other A-shell company with a fake address 2 towns over. But it led back to Leon Vickers' son, who listed it as a consulting business, despite having no clients beyond the HOA. Janine ran the numbers. Over $82,000 in transfers over 2 years, all masked as routine maintenance or community strategy sessions. Caleb called it classic fraud. I called it fuel. We packaged everything into a formal complaint to the Oregon Department of Justice, financial misappropriation, selective enforcement, and intimidation. Caleb made sure it was airtight. We had testimony, timestamps, screenshots, paper trails, and a growing list of residents willing to quietly corroborate what they'd endured. Then came the spark that lit the fuse. Late one night, our cameras caught Deputy Rick Bowen, Cynthia's pet officer, creeping around my truck with a flashlight. 2 hours later, he returned in uniform, claimed to have received an anonymous tip about narcotics in the vehicle. He asked to search. I said nothing, just handed him the keys and stepped back. He found a small package taped under the driver's seat, opened it, expecting some planted substance. Instead, it was a pouch of baking sugar wrapped in plastic. That's when I handed him a flash drive footage from 2 separate angles showing him planting it 3 hours earlier. His face drained. His partner, clearly not in on the plan, demanded an explanation on the spot. The chief got called in. Within hours, Bowen was in custody. It was a clean takedown, but more importantly, it gave us something we'd been waiting for, a fracture big enough for the public to see. We released the footage through Janine's old newsroom. Within 24 hours, the story had been picked up by 3 local stations and a statewide watchdog blog. A decorated Special Forces vet being targeted by corrupt HOA leadership and a dirty cop. It had all the elements the media loved. And for once, public outrage was on our side. Cynthia panicked. She called an emergency HOA meeting at her house, breaking every open meeting rule in the book. But this time, we were ready. Caleb had a court order in hand, forcing any HOA business to be public. Wesley served it at her door, while the local press looked on. Behind him, nearly 40 residents had gathered, signs, phones recording. No more fear. We weren't a lone couple anymore. We were a movement, and the final phase of the operation had just begun. It's strange how fast power evaporates when you drag it into the daylight. The footage of Deputy Bowen planting fake evidence played on the evening news like a slow-motion confession. Cynthia tried to spin it, claimed we were orchestrating a smear campaign, but her voice cracked during her interview, and her smile had lost its plastic shine. Even the local anchors didn't bother to hide their skepticism. 2 days later, our forum doubled in size. Residents who had stayed silent for years began posting their own stories. An Army widow who had been fined for flying a second flag on Memorial Day, a young couple whose request for solar panels was denied while Cynthia's were quietly installed with no permits, a single father fined because his daughter's mobility ramp wasn't painted community beige. We compiled the stories into affidavits. Caleb submitted them to the Department of Justice, along with a request for criminal investigation. Meanwhile, Janine's article hit the front page of 3 regional papers, Power, Property, and Corruption. How a small-town HOA nearly got away with it. It wasn't just fraud anymore. It was a conspiracy. Then came the anonymous leak. A former HOA accountant sent us a backup of financial records, including records Cynthia and Leon had tried to erase. It showed over $250,000 misappropriated in less than 5 years. Vacation expenses disguised as retreats, HOA dues funneled into offshore accounts. Payments made to contractors who didn't exist or whose licenses had long since expired. The state moved fast after that. Search warrants were issued. Cynthia's house, Leon's condo, the HOA's rental office in the strip mall off Route 7, raided in one morning. Computers, binders, phones, all seized. Cynthia was escorted out of her home in handcuffs, still wearing her tennis whites and designer sunglasses. I stood across the street. I didn't cheer, didn't gloat. I just watched as the illusion she built crumbled piece by piece under the weight of accountability. But even in her final hours of control, she tried to tighten her grip. She sent out a final HOA-wide letter proposing a special assessment of $2,000 per household for legal defense and reputation repair. It was absurd, but the fact that she tried it told me one thing. She still believed she could win. She didn't realize the residents she used to bully were now the ones writing the rules. That night, we held a town hall. Over 100 people packed the community center, some for the first time in years. I stood up front beside Elena. Her arm finally healed and laid out everything we had uncovered. I ended with one line. You can only be intimidated by a system when you forget that you are the system. And with that, Redwood Hollow took its first step towards something it hadn't known in a long time. Freedom. 3 months after Cynthia's arrest, Redwood Hollow looked different. Not in the superficial ways she used to obsess over uniform lawns, HOA-approved shutters, or whether your mailbox was regulation beige. No, this was something deeper, more human. The new interim board, elected by overwhelming vote, immediately repealed half the nonsense regulations. They opened the books, canceled all unjust fines, and returned nearly $40,000 in overpayments to residents. Community fees dropped by 25%, and yet somehow services improved. Funny how things work when money isn't being funneled into someone's vacation fund. The trellis I built for Elena, still standing, covered now in flowering jasmine, hummingbirds dancing around it every morning. She calls it our monument, not to war, but to endurance. Her shoulder aches when the weather turns, but she says it's worth it. A scar is just a reminder that you survived. Troy Maddox ended up working maintenance for the community center, voluntarily. It wasn't court-ordered. He asked for it, said Elena, treating him like a person, made him realize how far off track he'd gotten. I believed him. As for me, I started teaching monthly workshops for other neighborhoods. Not self-defense this time, but civic defense. How to identify abuse of power, document it and dismantle it, using law instead of fear. Different battlefield, same mission. 1 year after it all began, we hosted the first real community celebration Redwood Hollow had ever seen. No restrictions, no citations, Just laughter, shared meals, and neighbors, learning each other's names again. Someone asked me if I regretted getting involved. I looked at Elena, laughing, with a woman who used to cross the street to avoid us, and said what I meant from the start. Sometimes you don't get to choose the battle, but you always get to choose whether you stand. And we stood together.